In the last episode, looking at Camus' The Rebel, we'd got to the point where he had talked about the king killers, where particularly referring to the French Revolution, where the king's mandate to rule, gained apparently because of his authority derived from God, had been turned over, and the new rulers were governing by the mandate of reason itself. And then we'd gone on to mention how Hegel had gone further than that by stating that reason itself was not an unmodifiable concept, but it was something that changed and evolved, as did man, as did morality, as did God. Everything was changing. So this week, or in the next part of the book, Camus goes on to talk about individual terrorism. He mentions a few people by name and discusses them. In particular, he mentions a few Russian people, Bakunin, Nechayev, Bielinski, and a Frenchman, Proudhon, and Dostoevsky, who's particularly his novel The Possessed, that we mentioned a few times already, gets another mention here, and also another Russian novelist, Turgenev. So as he brings all these characters up, a lot of the time he's still really dealing with Hegel and Hegel's influence on all of those people. So Nechayev was a revolutionary in Russia in the middle part of the 19th century, particularly violent one, and at one stage he actually killed one of the members of his own revolutionary group because that member objected to some of the more extreme activities that Nechayev was advocating. And it's believed that that particular event, which was notorious in Russia at the time, may have been the inspiration for Dostoevsky's novel The Possessed that we've looked at before and we'll mention again, in which a member of the revolutionary group is murdered, or several are. Bakunin was another prominent revolutionary in 19th century Russia and was also quite active in some of the revolutions that actually took place in Western Europe in the middle part of the century as well. He was actually an aristocrat by birth, so not a proletariat at all. He'd at one stage joined Marx's International Working Men's Association, and they were colleagues for some time, although they did fall out. And one gets the impression that Marx wasn't somebody who could really be very interested in any person who wasn't prepared to accept everything that he said and advocated as being the truth and the only truth. And that Bakunin was probably someone who couldn't long continue to be able to be led by any other person. So they weren't going to, the relationship wasn't going to last, and it didn't. And then later on, Marx wrote a number of tracts explaining in detail what was wrong with Bakunin's thinking. Anyway, so Camus brings all of those characters up, but in doing so, again, he's still referring to Hegel and Hegel's influence on them. One of the other points he makes about Hegel is that he had this idea of this thing, what he called an immanence, which I think means something dwelling inside a person which is not actually necessarily of the same substance as the person, but is a part of him because it's in him or her, which I suppose sounds like the spirit or perhaps even God. But Hegel is careful to point out that he by no means means God, certainly not in the sense that there's some vertical relationship between this immanence in us and some higher being above us. In fact, he's quite keen to make sure that we don't make the mistake of believing that, and he says that provisional immanence is in fact a provisional atheism which will wipe the face of God from the mind of the world. So this idea that he has of some spirit within us, he's actually employing that idea to get rid of the notion of an external and internal God who's separate and above us. And certainly and so the way that plays out in Nechayev and Bakunin's thoughts and projects is really carrying forward that idea that we mentioned of Hegel's from last week, that everything is changing, reason is changing, will no longer be the same in the future as it is now, justice is changing, morality is changing, so nothing is going to be the same. We've just got to be ready to move into something totally new. And so some of these radical revolutionary thinkers like Bakunin and Nechayev wanted to sort of move the process forward quickly. If everything's going to change and be different, then why don't we just get rid of everything now that's here and clear the ground, and we can start again from something totally new. And that was what they actually set out to achieve. So Camus gives a quote which he attributes to both Bakunin and Nechayev. I don't know if they both said it or one did and the other agreed, but anyway, the quote is, "Our mission is to destroy, not to construct." And he also quotes another person, I presume a German, called Feuerbach, who said, "No religion is my religion. No philosophy is my philosophy." And then again he quotes Hegel, who says, "If reality is inconceivable, then we must contrive inconceivable concepts." So basically they had this idea, let's destroy everything, break everything down, get rid of all our existing society, even our existing thoughts and ideas, we'll start again build something new from that. And there was this concept of nihilism, which really encapsulates all that. And it's thought that Turgenev, another Russian novelist who was a contemporary of Dostoevsky, wrote this book called Fathers and Sons. The main character in that, Bazarov, is put forward as a typical nihilist. And there are some people who suggest that the actual word nihilism itself was actually coined by Turgenev to describe this character, but it was adopted widely from that. I'm not sure if that's true or not. So Bazarov wanted to get rid of everything, not just morality, but even culture, art, poetry. He dismissed all of them as just nonsense, and ridiculed them when he saw other people enjoying them and seeming to find value in them. The character, Bazarov, actually is an interest. I mean, he comes across as quite a romantic character. Women tend to fall in love with him, and he sometimes falls in love with them. But then he has to spurn them so that he can then go on with his lonely quest in pursuit of his philosophical goals. So it really makes a lot of good material for a popular romantic novel. Bazarov is kind of Byronic, really, a kind of a latter-day Byron. And so Turgenev's novel was very well received, both by the intelligentsia and by the wider reading public, much to the disgust of Dostoevsky, really. And Dostoevsky and Turgenev were both colleagues, but they had a falling out as well, partly over this. So Dostoevsky both Turgenev and Dostoevsky wrote these books in which they created a character who was expressing and living out the consequences of one of these advanced, radical, revolutionary, Hegelian sort of ideas, and somewhat demonstrating the consequences of that. But Dostoevsky really regarded Turgenev as being not genuine at all and being kind of a phony, really. Turgenev was doing what Dostoevsky did, creating a character to be an embodiment of this kind of way of thinking, and it made for a good, strong plot for a novel. But what Turgenev wasn't doing was what Dostoevsky was doing, which was, well, Turgenev wasn't advocating for that person's point of view, but he wasn't, as Dostoevsky was, really trying to demonstrate the absolute madness and folly of that idea and the evil of the consequences of it. And that's what Dostoevsky couldn't tolerate in Turgenev. And so with with all this activity of abolishing God, God is not going to exist anymore, we're going to totally obliterate him, and that's what they were thinking and wanting to do, it's, I think, inevitable that Satan was involved in that. They probably didn't realise it at the time, but it becomes quite apparent that the devil is really in that to a large extent. And we're getting back to what we were talking about a few weeks ago with Milton's Paradise Lost. But I think even if they didn't, some of these people did consciously recognise that's what they were doing. For example, we mentioned Proudhon, who was one of the early leaders of the socialist movement in France before Marx kind of tended to dominate the field. But he said at one stage, God is evil, and he wanted to actually bring back Satan. And Bakunin, who we've talked about, said he wanted a satanic rebellion against divine authority, and that would free humanity. And he spoke favourably about a I suppose, kind of prophetic religious movement with a kind of a primitive socialism that arose in Bohemia in the 14th century. And they were wanting to transform society into a kind of a socialist utopia, but then their password was, "In the name of him to whom a great wrong has been done," which I think is something that the Freemasons talk about in the Illuminati. The one to whom a great wrong has been done is again something that I think Milton's Lucifer is talking about. A great wrong has been done to himself, he believes, that he's been unjustly treated by God by being punished, but also by not being recognised as probably the rightful ruler of heaven. That's where Lucifer felt he should be. So that 14th century group was setting their society up in the name of this one who believes a great wrong has been done to him, and that's the one they wanted to worship. There were some in these sort of radical progressive movements that were reluctant to be quite so extreme and reluctant to engage in violence. And Camus speaks of what he calls the fastidious assassins. So in the latter part of the 19th century in Russia, a lot of revolutionaries were throwing bombs to try and assassinate the Tsar and government officials and so on, and did kill a few. But some of them, in the process of doing that, were very careful not to kill the Tsar or the government official's family or any innocent bystanders, and they were upset when that happened anyway. And they tried to come to terms with that. They had to commit these violent acts to get rid of these people that they thought needed to be got out of the way, but they were disturbed when other collateral damage occurred. And the only way they could reconcile themselves to that was by causing themselves to die in the process. And they thought if they got killed, then somehow that would their conscience would be clear, I suppose, and they would be able to deal with the fact that other people had died as well.